If you were alive in the early 2000s, that sound is burned into your brain. It was not just a ringtone. It was the anthem of a revolution. There was a time when that simple monophonic melody was heard billions of times a day. In every corner of the planet, from the high-rise boardrooms of New York City to the bustling streets of New Delhi. Before the iPhone, before Android, before we spent our lives scrolling through social media feeds, there was Nokia. And Nokia was not just a company. It was the king. To understand the sheer scale of their dominance, you have to look at the numbers. And they are absolutely staggering. At its peak, this Finnish giant commanded 40% of the entire global mobile phone market. To put that into perspective, imagine if Apple and Samsung combined their market share today, and then added a little bit more. That was Nokia. In 2007, just before everything fell apart, the company was valued at $150 billion. They contributed to a massive chunk of Finland's entire GDP. They were Europe's crowning achievement in technology. If you needed to make a call, you used a Nokia. If you dropped your phone down a flight of stairs, you didn't panic. You just picked it up, snapped the plastic back on, and kept talking. They were indestructible. They were ubiquitous. They were invincible, or so they thought. Because in the span of just 6 years, this titan of industry lost over 90% of its market value. They went from owning the world to being sold off for parts to Microsoft in a deal that many considered a humiliation. It is one of the most brutal, rapid, and catastrophic collapses in business history. So, what happened? The easy answer is to blame the iPhone. People like to say that Steve Jobs walked onto a stage, pulled a glass rectangle out of his pocket, and killed Nokia instantly. But that is not the true story. The truth is much darker, much more complex, and frankly, much more interesting. The truth is that Nokia was dead long before the first iPhone was ever sold. They just didn't know it yet. To understand how a $300 billion empire evaporates, we have to go back, not to the 90s, but all the way back to 1865. It might surprise you to learn that the company that connected the world started out making toilet paper. Well, paper pulp, to be exact, located on the banks of the Nokianvirta River in Finland. The company began as a humble paper mill. For over a century, they had nothing to do with electronics. They were an industrial conglomerate. They made rubber boots. They made car tires. They made frantic cables. They even made gas masks for the Finnish army. Nokia was a company that made physical, heavy, industrial things. And this DNA, this obsession with hardware and physical engineering, would eventually become their greatest strength. And later, their fatal flaw. The pivot that changed the world happened in the 1990s, under the leadership of a visionary CEO named Jorma Ollila. Nokia made a radical decision. They decided to sell off all their other businesses. The rubber, the paper, the cables, all of it had to go. They pushed all their chips into the center of the table on a new, emerging technology called GSM, the global system for mobile communications. It was a massive gamble. If mobile phones turned out to be a fad, the entire Finnish economy would have taken a hit. But the gamble paid off, spectacularly. By the late 90s, Nokia wasn't just participating in the mobile revolution, they were dictating it. They understood something that their American competitors like Motorola didn't. Motorola, at the time, was run by engineers who saw phones as utilitarian devices. Basically walkie-talkies for businessmen. Nokia saw them as fashion accessories. They saw them as consumer products. They introduced interchangeable covers, allowing teenagers to change the color of their phone to match their outfit. They introduced the first mobile games, making Snake a global obsession. They realized that a phone wasn't just about making calls, it was about lifestyle. This was the golden age. The Nokia 3310, released in the year 2000, became a cultural icon. It sold 126 million units. It was robust, reliable, and the battery lasted for what felt like weeks. Then came the Nokia 1100 in 2003, a basic, cheap handset designed for developing markets. It became the best-selling consumer electronics device in history. with over 250 million units sold. Think about that. Not just the best-selling phone, the best-selling electronic device ever. Nokia was printing money. Their supply chain was a marvel of the modern world. They could churn out new models faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than anyone else. They had the best logistics, the best hardware engineers, and the strongest brand recognition on earth. In the early 2000s, Nokia's slogan was connecting people, and they really believed it. The culture inside the company during this rise was electric. It was open, innovative, and brave. Engineers felt empowered to try new things. They experimented with wild designs. Remember the Nokia N-Gage? The taco-shaped phone that tried to be a game console? Or the lipstick phone? Sure, some of them were failures. But it showed a company that was fearless. They were the cool kids of the tech world. But as the company grew into a global behemoth, something started to shift. Success, as it often does, started to breed complacency. When you are the undisputed king of the hill, when you are making money hand over fist, it is very hard to imagine that you are doing anything wrong. The leadership team, the same team that had brilliantly pivoted the company in the 90s, started to believe their own hype. They started to believe that the way things were, was the way things would always be. Internally, the company was becoming a bureaucracy. It was becoming heavy. The agile, spirited startup culture was being replaced by layers of middle management. And crucial to this story, the hardware engineers were the rock stars. In Nokia's world, the physical device was king. The software, the user interface, the operating system, that was just something you had to put on the phone to make the buttons work. It was secondary. This mindset was perfectly fine in 1999 when all people wanted to do was call and text. But the world was changing. The internet was coming to mobile. And Nokia was about to find out that being the best at building hardware doesn't matter if your software is a mess. But before the fall, there were warning signs that were ignored. In 2004, some engineers at Nokia actually built a prototype of a touchscreen phone with a single button. Does that sound familiar? They showed it to management, and management killed it. Why? Because it would be too expensive to manufacture. They looked at their spreadsheets. They looked at their high profit margins on cheap candy bar phones. And they said, no, the market doesn't want this. The market wants cheap, durable phones with buttons. This moment, arguably, is where the seed of their destruction was planted. They were optimizing for the present, while the future was being built in a secret lab in Cupertino, California. Let's talk about Symbian. You cannot tell the story of Nokia's death without talking about Symbian. This was their operating system. At the time, it was the dominant smartphone OS in the world. But Symbian was a nightmare. It was clunky, difficult to develop for, and incredibly old. Adding a new feature to Symbian was like trying to add a new floor to a house that was built on quicksand. But Nokia was addicted to it. They had invested billions in it. Everyone in the company knew how to use it. Moving away from Symbian would have been a massive, painful undertaking. So, instead of building something new from scratch, they just kept patching it up. They kept adding layers of code on top of a rotting foundation. By 2006, just a year before the iPhone, Nokia was flying high. Their stock price was soaring. The executives were being celebrated on the covers of business magazines. But inside the headquarters in Espoo, Finland, a culture of fear was taking root. This is a critical psychological aspect of the collapse. Middle managers were terrified of bringing bad news to the top executives. The top leaders were known to be temperamental and demanding. They wanted to hear that sales were up, that targets were being met, and that Nokia was winning. So, if an engineer said, "Sir, Symbian is failing," or "Sir, the competition is catching up," they were often silenced or ignored. Reports were sanitized. Data was cherry-picked. The board of directors was looking at a map that didn't match the territory. They were steering the ship based on bad information, sailing full speed ahead into an iceberg that everyone below deck could see. But no one on the bridge wanted to acknowledge. January 9, 2007. This is the date that marks the beginning of the end. On a stage in San Francisco, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. He famously described it as 3 devices in one. a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. The audience cheered, the tech press went wild. But in Finland, the executives at Nokia were not cheering. And surprisingly, they weren't panicking either, they were shrugging. When Nokia's engineers got their hands on the first iPhone, they took it apart. They analyzed every component, and their report back to the board was scathing. They said the phone was a joke. The call quality was mediocre. It didn't even support 3G networks, which was already standard in Europe. The camera was terrible, and crucially, it failed the drop test. If you dropped an iPhone on concrete, it shattered. To Nokia, a company that prided itself on building phones that could survive a nuclear winter, this was unacceptable. They looked at the price tag, $500 on contract, and laughed. They concluded that the iPhone was a niche product for wealthy Americans, a toy that would never gain mass market adoption. This reaction is the perfect definition of missing the forest for the trees. Nokia was judging the iPhone based on the old rules of the game. They were judging it on hardware specs, battery life, and durability. But Apple had changed the rules. The iPhone wasn't about the hardware, it was about the software. It was about the user experience. It was about the magic of pinching to zoom on a photo, the fluidity of the interface, the full web browsing experience in your pocket. Nokia's leaders looked at the lack of a physical keyboard as a flaw. Steve Jobs saw it as liberation. By dismissing the touchscreen as a gimmick, Nokia signed its own death warrant. But the iPhone wasn't just a phone. A year later, Apple launched the App Store. This was the final nail in the coffin, though Nokia didn't feel it yet. Suddenly, a phone wasn't just what came in the box. It was a platform. Developers could build games, tools, and social networks on top of it. Nokia had an App Store too, called OV Store, but it was a disaster. It was hard to use. Payments were a mess, and developers hated it. While the Apple App Store was exploding with Angry Birds and flashlights and productivity tools, Nokia users were struggling just to download a ringtone. The ecosystem was shifting, and Nokia was left standing on a lonely island. By 2008, the panic started to set in. The sales numbers for the iPhone were defying gravity. Nokia realized they needed a touch-screen phone, and they needed it yesterday. But remember Symbian? That old, clunky operating system? It was never designed for touch. It was designed for buttons. Trying to make Symbian work with a touchscreen was like trying to steer a cruise ship with a bicycle handle. It was unresponsive, laggy, and frustrating. Nokia rushed out their response, the Nokia 5800 Express Music. It sold well initially because of the brand loyalty, but users hated it. The screen was resistive, meaning you had to press down hard with a stylus or fingernail. Unlike the iPhone's capacitive screen which reacted to the lightest touch of skin, using a Nokia touch phone felt like fighting with the device. Using an iPhone felt like magic. Then came the disaster that destroyed their reputation, the Nokia N97. Released in 2009, this was supposed to be the iPhone killer. It had a slide-out keyboard, a big screen, and impressive specs on paper. Nokia hyped it as the ultimate mobile computer. But when it shipped, it was a catastrophe. The software was buggy. The phone would crash constantly. The internet browser was unusable. It was a flagship phone that felt like a prototype. Anzi Vanjoki, a senior Nokia executive, later admitted that the N97 was a huge disappointment for the quality of the experience. But by then, it was too late. Trust is hard to build and easy to break. And with the N97, Nokia broke the trust of their most loyal high-end customers. While Nokia was busy obsessing over Apple, a silent assassin was creeping up from behind. Google. In 2008, Google released Android. This was a critical moment. Google saw what Apple did and realized the old way was dead. They didn't try to build their own hardware. Instead, they built an operating system that was modern, touch-friendly, and most importantly, free. They gave Android away to Samsung, HTC, Motorola, and LG. Google actually approached Nokia. They wanted Nokia to be the primary partner for Android. Imagine a parallel universe where Nokia said yes. A Nokia phone with the build quality of Finland and the software of Google. It would have been unstoppable. But Nokia said no. Their pride wouldn't let them. They were the market leaders. Why would they use someone else's software? They believed they could fix Symbian. Or better yet, build their own next-generation OS called Memo, and later MeeGo. This decision to reject Android and fight a two-front war against Apple and the army of Android clones was strategic suicide. Samsung, which was a minor player at the time, embraced Android fully. They flooded the market with cheap, good-enough touch-screen phones. Nokia was now being squeezed from both ends. At the high end, Apple was stealing their premium customers. At the low end, cheap Androids were eating their mass market share. Inside Nokia, the situation was chaotic. By 2010, the company was paralyzed by internal politics. There were rival factions fighting for resources. One team was trying to patch up Symbian. Another team was working on MeeGo. Another team was working on low-end phones. There was no unified vision. The company had become so big, so bureaucratic, that they couldn't move. A former executive described the meetings as endless PowerPoint presentations where nothing was decided. They had the talent. They had thousands of brilliant engineers. But the management structure was stifling them. Innovative ideas were killed because they threatened existing product lines. For example, Nokia actually had a working App Store concept years before Apple. They had touch-screen prototypes years before the iPhone. They had tablet concepts. But none of them ever made it to market because the managers in charge of the cash cow, dumb phone, division saw them as a threat to their bonuses. It is the classic innovator's dilemma. They were so afraid of cannibalizing their own sales that they let competitors eat them alive. By late 2010, the writing was on the wall. Profits were tanking. The stock price had collapsed. The board of directors finally realized that the old guard had to go. They fired the CEO and, for the first time in the company's history, hired a non-Fin to run the show. They brought in Stephen Elop from Microsoft. He was tasked with saving a sinking ship. But what he found when he arrived was worse than anyone imagined. He found a company that was still in denial. A company that was pouring gasoline on a burning platform. Stephen Elop is a controversial figure in this story. Some see him as the man who tried his best to save a dying patient. Others see him as a Trojan horse who deliberately destroyed Nokia to sell it to Microsoft. But regardless of his intent, his first major act as CEO became the stuff of legend. He wrote a memo to all employees. It was brutal, honest, and terrifying. It became known as the burning platform memo. In it, he told the staff a story about a man working on an oil rig in the North Sea. The rig catches fire. The man has a choice. Stay on the platform and burn to death. Or jump into the freezing, dark water. Elop told his employees, "We are standing on a burning platform." He laid out the harsh truth. Apple owns the high end. Android owns the mid-range. And even the low end is being attacked by cheap Chinese manufacturers. He said, "We have missed big trends. We have missed time. And we haven't delivered." It was a wake-up call. But for many, it sounded more like a eulogy. The question was, now that they had jumped off the burning platform, where would they land? And the decision Elop made next would be the final, controversial chapter in the history of Nokia phones. The choice facing Stephen Elop was binary. Jump into the crowded pool of Android manufacturers, or place a massive bet on a third ecosystem. Elop believed that if Nokia went with Android, they would just become another Samsung. They would lose their identity. They would be commoditized. So, in February 2011, he announced a strategic partnership with Microsoft. Nokia would adopt Windows Phone as its primary operating system. On paper, it made sense. Microsoft had the software expertise and the enterprise connections. Nokia had the hardware genius and the global distribution. It was a marriage of two giants desperate to stay relevant in the mobile age. But in reality, it was two drowning swimmers grabbing onto each other, hoping to float. The immediate effect of this announcement was catastrophic. This is known in business as the Osborne effect. By telling the world that Symbian was a burning platform, and that Windows was the future. Elip effectively told customers, "Don't buy our current phones. They are obsolete garbage." But here was the problem. The new Windows phones weren't ready yet. They wouldn't be ready for another 9 months. So, sales of Symbian phones fell off a cliff instantly. And Nokia had nothing to replace them with. Revenue plummeted. The stock price crashed even further. They had set fire to their own house before the new one was built. When the first Nokia Windows phones, the Lumia series, finally arrived in late 2011, they were actually beautiful. The Lumia 800 and 900 were distinct. They were colorful, built from polycarbonate unibody shells that felt amazing in the hand. The interface was fresh and modern. It didn't look like an iPhone, and it didn't look like Android. It had live tiles. It was fluid. Critics actually loved the hardware. The cameras, specifically the PureView technology, were years ahead of Apple. But a great phone is useless without apps. And this was the wall that Nokia hit at full speed. This is what we call the app gap. Users would buy a Lumia, love the hardware, but then ask, where is Instagram? Where is YouTube? Where is Snapchat? And the answer was, coming soon. But they never came soon enough. Developers didn't want to build apps for Windows Phone because there were no users. And users didn't want to buy Windows phones because there were no apps. It was a vicious cycle of death. While Apple and Google had millions of apps, the Windows marketplace was a ghost town. Nokia tried to bribe developers. They tried to build the apps themselves, but it didn't work. The network effect of iOS and Android was too strong. People were locked into their ecosystems. iMessage kept people on iPhone. Google Maps and Gmail kept people on Android. Nokia was selling a beautiful empty house in a neighborhood where nobody lived. By 2013, the situation was terminal. Nokia was bleeding cash. They had burned through their reserves. The share price, which was once over $60, was trading at under $4. The board had no moves left. On September 3, 2013, the news broke. Microsoft would acquire Nokia's Devices and Services division for $7.2 billion. $7.2 billion. It sounds like a lot of money. But remember, a few years earlier, Nokia was worth $300 billion. They were sold for pennies on the dollar. The deal was finalized in 2014. Stephen Elip went back to Microsoft. Thousands of Nokia employees in Finland lost their jobs. The manufacturing plants were closed or sold. The Nokia logo was eventually removed from the phones, replaced by Microsoft. The king was dead. But the tragedy didn't end there. The acquisition turned out to be a disaster for Microsoft too. The culture clash was immense. The strategy failed. Just a year later, the new Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, wrote off nearly the entire value of the acquisition. He basically admitted it was a mistake and fired thousands more people. The Nokia mobile phone business effectively ceased to exist as we knew it. So, is Nokia gone today? Surprisingly, no. And this is the twist in the story. While the phone business died, the company survived. Today, Nokia is a very different beast. They focused on what they were originally good at, infrastructure. They are now one of the world's largest telecommunications equipment manufacturers. They build the 5G networks that power your iPhone and your Android. They are a profitable, quiet, business-to-business giant. They even license their brand name to a company called HMD Global, which now makes Android phones with the Nokia logo on them. So, you can still buy a Nokia phone today. But it's a ghost. It's a brand rented out to a startup. A nostalgic echo of the past. The fall of Nokia is more than just a business case study. It is a human story about hubris. It teaches us that success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. Nokia failed because they fell in love with their own reflection. They loved their hardware, their factories, and their legacy more than they loved their customers. They forgot that technology is not about the device. It's about what the device allows people to do. They ignored the software revolution. They ignored the cultural shift. They ruled with fear instead of curiosity. And in the ruthless world of technology, if you stop innovating for even a moment, you don't just lose your place at the top. You cease to exist. Nokia connected people, but in the end, they failed to connect with the future.